Welcome to the Bullshitter Podcast. Join us as we discuss some serious BS. We have the realest conversations about so many real things, like real paranormal experiences, real conspiracy theories that can lead you down rabbit holes, canceling the cancel culture, astrology for the USA, and more, exposing the mainstream narrative, spiritual growth journeys, and business owners dealing with some real BS, and, on occasion, some aliens and some UFOs. Hi, today we're going to talk about the Joe Rogan and Neil Young controversy and the Whoopi Goldberg controversy and some of the stuff they said. Some of you might know that Neil Young and Joe Rogan had a little spat over Spotify and supposed disinformation in quotations. Um, and Whoopi Goldberg said that supposedly or allegedly said on live television that the Holocaust wasn't about racism. So today, as our guest, we're going to have Reverend Rick Cempie on, and he's going to talk to us a little bit today about some of this. We'll see where this goes.
Hey there, Anthony. Good to be here.
Hi, it's good to have you on the show. And so, what's your take on this whole Joe Rogan, Neil Young controversy and Whoopi Goldberg controversy? Uh, I know you have a little
Well,
bit more of a following on Whoopi Goldberg than you do on the Joe Rogan Neil Young controversy.
right. And, I'm familiar with different artists, celebrities. They all have a way of saying something and getting in the middle of all kinds of controversy because that makes news, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, it makes news. So Joe Rogan and Neil Young had a little spat over Joe Rogan having Dr. Robert Malone on his show, and actually, it's kind of funny because after this, all the dust kind of settled. Neil Young's music's now back on Spotify after he threatened to remove it, and Joe Rogan's episode with Dr. Robert Malone, that's been banned just about everywhere, is still on Spotify, home of probably one of the last platforms for free speech. And yeah, it just kind of looked like a big controversy about nothing at the end of the day, really. It was just over some words that were said, and maybe disinformation, and maybe good information, and I don't know. A lot's come out since then. Um, yeah, so the Joe Rogan Neil Young controversy is kind of over. Joe Rogan apologized for some of the things he said and said he's going to try to do a better job. And I'm not real sure what Whoopi Goldberg said, but I do know, and maybe it can help everyone else understand exactly what Whoopi Goldberg meant when she said that the Holocaust wasn't about race.
Well, there's certainly disparity in how people process the information. And there are things that are declared openly, and of course, there's things that aren't declared openly. The
Yeah,
the part that Whoopi was referencing was that it's difficult to go ahead and identify. You don't identify Jews just by looking at them the same way you can identify a black person, an Oriental person, someone from India. You can see by looking. You can see pasty white guys just by looking. So it's something different. She referred to ethnicity, you know, in a sense, in her defense. So it was such a difficulty that the Jews had to identify or get identified by other people, and then they had to be identified by wearing a star on their jacket, you know, because you can't tell just by looking at them. I get it. It Where she missed the mark was that, you know, it is understood culturally as racial, and that you can't ignore.
Yeah, at least here in the United States, it's, I don't know. I think we have a confusion with words.
Absolutely. Um, we have words introduced in the culture, and people use them one way, but the people listening, they can interpret them from their own bias and understanding, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, I can agree with that. There's some crazy things happening right now with words. It's like a big word salad of nonsense,
Absolutely.
and everybody's freaking out over all these words. Uh, yeah, I just don't. I don't know what to really think about it. Honestly, it seems like, well,
Well,
that's what
socialist
was
is a
in.
good word to start with
Yeah,
because there were a lot of social programs that came out after uh, the stock market crash. We started having welfare, and nobody complained that the government was helping people out.
well, no.
While it was a big need, everybody seemed to get it. Well, sorry, folks, that's social. That is the reality, and it is not a bad thing to look after people. Uh, we look to our government to do that.
Yeah, we
That's part of
do.
their responsibility.
Yeah, it is. It's part of their responsibility, and it's definitely part of their responsibility when they, tax people, and that's what people are paying taxes for, is for these things to happen.
For us to be taken care of with the money we give them.
Yeah, and it's a good thing to take care of people, and I totally agree with that. And to what extent, I'm not sure what's appropriate, but I also know that the tax money doesn't always get used appropriately either, like it should be,
Right.
people bailing out their brothers and sisters and, that are politicians isn't a good thing. And it just seems like this mainstream narrative of words has consumed everything, that everybody's calling each other out over words. There's a bunch of yelling and screaming about what all of these words mean. Well, no,
Absolutely.
nobody really
And they're
knows.
taking offense.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
taking it as an attack. And uh, they don't have the openness to just listen to what someone's saying without trying to figure out how they're going to respond next. They're
yeah,
not really hearing what people have to say.
yeah. I agree. I think that there's a big confusion. I know we had talked earlier, and I'm gonna tell everyone that this was your quote because it was. You actually had said, "Well, what does everyone mean by words?" And I walked around for the next couple days thinking, "Wow, that's the best quote I've heard, and that's the best thing I've heard said in a long time." The best question, I guess. So, well, what is the difference between ethnicity and racism and bigotry?
Wow. There's, yeah. What a mouthful you just said, which is essentially what we're getting at. But, I find in social justice work, there's a lot of people having difficulty identifying their place in the mix as to how they have lived their lives, and they are there are so many that I know are not bigots, and they feel like they're not racist, but that doesn't mean they have not been part of the culture. They've grown up in the culture, they've benefited from the culture, and that has created privilege for them in some places, and in other places with immigrants, with black people, people of color, the indigenous population, they are disregarded.
Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of that gets disregarded, and pretty much everybody that's here came here from somewhere else. You know, my family's my
Mm-hmm.
dad's side of my family's Italian, and we know they got here and they got treated like crap, and well, they were laborers. You know, obviously we know what the racial slur for them is, and we don't need to say it. You know, obviously on a podcast, but it's like the only people that seem to have really been hit hard in modern times is the people in the inner city. 'Cause it seems like where most of this goes on. You know, you hear about police brutality and stuff in the cities, and we have it out in rural Western Pennsylvania also, but not to the same extent that as what's going on in the inner cities with people of color. And living where I live, there's not a ton of people of color because we're in the Appalachian Mountains, and you know there's just not a lot of them out here because they seem to be stuck in the inner cities. A lot of them do. I think it's probably something that has to do with like a systematic oppression from being in those cities. And I don't know. I'm never going to be able to wrap my head around it because I didn't live it. So,
Right.
was I privileged to live here? Yeah. I thank God every day that I was born in the United States and I was born in Western Pennsylvania because I don't deal with the stuff that goes on in the cities.
Sure.
And you're from uh, the
I've
Pitts.
worked in all three river valleys of the Pittsburgh area.
Yeah, so
So,
you have a little bit more knowledge and you're like 60 miles away from me.
right.
And there's a big cultural gap 60 miles apart, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But the biggest thing about these words is that this call to arms to censor people and censorship is gotten out of control to this point, in my opinion, when the White House press secretary is asking, in quotations, basically firmly asking for big tech to censor people for disinformation. Well, who decides if it's disinformation?
Sure. Because that. Oh wow. The certainly the people that are spreading the disinformation will accuse those that are trying to call it out as the ones who are spreading disinformation. So they're like attacking one another, putting that responsibility on the enemy. You know, we're not spreading disinformation, you are. You know?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that when the government's asking for censorship of by big tech, it's like a gray area for them to skate around the First Amendment. And First Amendment's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day, but it's like they're just skating around it. And now there's so much information out there because of the internet, and we're surrounded by, um, new technology, and well, we have the internet. The internet's bigger than Google. Also, I just want to let everyone know that's listening to this is that Google's not the only place to get information from. There's other places. There's DuckDuckGo. There's a million other places to get. And DuckDuckGo is actually a very secure website to a very secure search engine. There's a few other ones out there. I'm sure people will chime in comments as this podcast continues that there's other websites out there other than Google. Google's not the only browser, the search browser. Like the internet's way bigger than Google, trust me. I think Bill Gates probably knows that too. And I don't know who to believe anymore. And I never thought there'd be a time where I ever had to ask that question. Well, I don't know who to believe. Who's creating all this propaganda, you know? Like, and
Spin
how
is an
did
old
propaganda get
thing.
started?
I mean, it used to be the only people you had to worry about were snake oil salesmen, but now people are using the tactics to go ahead and push political agendas.
Yeah, and we have this big division over words and propaganda, or what's known as disinformation now. And They scream conspiracy theorists, and the other side screams you're tyrants. And I don't know which one's right and which one's wrong anymore. And it's hard to decipher just as an individual for myself to look at all of this information and go, well, who's telling the truth now?
And it gets more difficult because the media, are not just reporting the news; they're now creating the news because of their own agendas. We have places that are out there that are not news, but they are entertainment programs framed as sharing the news.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of a story I just read about, I think it was Roger Stone, I think that's his name, about his house getting raided by the FBI, and somehow CNN was there beforehand, which makes no sense because usually the news shows up after a raid. And also, then literally, like a few short days later, maybe it was a week, maybe it was 2 weeks, I don't remember, so don't quote me on this. Somehow, a CNN reporter was there to hear a boom at the synagogue incident that happened, the hostage situation that happened, that they said wasn't about race or ethnicity, which I don't know. I didn't really follow up with the whole entire story there. But again, those were authorities saying that it wasn't about race or ethnicity, and it was at a synagogue. Well, it definitely was because they were at a synagogue. I don't care what happened there. It was still there, and it was still
Right.
about the Jewish people because they were the ones that were held hostage. And, in history, that's not the first time they've ever been held hostage. So I'm sure it was traumatic for some of them that had heard their ancestors' stories. And some of them may still be alive that survived the Holocaust and live here now. We have a lady that lives in the area locally that was a former politician for Voltland that called herself a Nazi and said that the Holocaust never happened and she's from Germany. I
I
just
wonder how soon it came out that she had acknowledged being a Nazi if that happened after she was elected.
Well, it did happen after she was elected, and I don't know how long after she was elected. I want to say it was about almost 2 years because it came out literally a few months before the next municipal election, and it didn't go over so well because, well, she's no longer in office. And, I don't want to smear anybody on the podcast, but that's just something that there was something to attack somebody over using words, you know, saying that it never happened is that's nutty town to me.
Especially when in Germany, they own it. They don't make any bones about it. They acknowledge that it occurred, and they don't want to see it happen again.
Yeah. And it didn't go over well in this area of the United States in our backyard, which is majority white where I live. Um, and yeah, nobody here was okay with that. I think that there's a big, I don't know what the right word I want to use for it is, a big divide between the people in the city because of what they're being taught about people from the country. And I think what people from the country are being taught or told by the media about the people in the city.
Right.
And I think that if we all just got together and had conversations like this, we'd bring some civil back into civil discourse
Right. Right.
instead of paying attention to the media that's creating news. And if they're not creating it, boy, it's a big coincidence to be there all those times.
Exactly. And it's all in how the news is reported. It's
Yeah, so if you have all the news stations screaming at each other about this, that it's disinformation, or whether it's CNN talking about Fox or Fox talking about CNN, where did this idea of propaganda come from?
that's a good question, and in thinking about it in the past few days, I looked into it, and it has historically been used philosophically in a sense. It's the ideas behind it were used before having a word, which essentially, like, we didn't have the word clickbait until the recent internet experience. Well, that's kind of what the news had been using all along. Tune in. you know, we're going to be
Yeah.
talking about big ideas. And that is their tie in to go ahead and bring news forward. And how they present it ends up getting used to their own agenda at times, where they can showcase what's going on in one area versus another, and then people start getting upset about the reputation that is being had there.
Yeah.
Um, the work of propaganda goes back into antiquity,
So it's
ancient Greece.
been
But
around
at the
for a
same
long
time,
time.
yeah. And then the actual word was first created, oddly enough, 400 years ago on January 6th of 1622. The same day we had the 1 year anniversary of the Capitol building's riot. And talk about propaganda.
Yeah. So we're not even really sure what happened there because we know now that, well, there's some shady stuff going on around
Sure.
what happened there that day. Especially when the one guy has a tattoo that's a Soviet symbol tattooed on his arm that's standing inside our Capitol. That doesn't sound like someone that was a patriot to me. That sounds like someone that was more along the lines of rebel forces, which may or may not be Russia was intervening there. I
Yeah,
think,
it could simply be fringe with somebody who's not mentally well.
yeah, it could be. I mean, look
Which,
at,
I mean, we find that a lot in bad news reporting because somebody can identify with being a part of a group because that's what they feel. But at the same time, it's not what the majority of the people of that group espouse. I've been watching some stuff regarding Muhammad Ali, and after the attacks on 9/11, he said whatever whatever their background was, they may have been Muslim, but it is not God who suggests to destroy and uh, kill people that way. That God is a God of peace, and he was a devout Muslim, flawed man, admittedly so. But and I'm not saying I'm admitting that. I'm saying he admits that. You know.
yeah,
So with his own flaws, he says, "This is what God would say." This is
yeah,
not good.
yeah,
So somebody has a tattoo. Russia didn't ask him to put that tattoo on. He chose that. He could be doing whatever he wants in his own ideas.
yeah,
That
for
doesn't
sure.
mean it's all.
He could be, or agents could have radicalized him. There's a different million of different one conspiracy theories, which is kind of the next thing I wanted to mention here was like the word propaganda being created uh, through time. The word conspiracy theory got created also by allegedly the most unlikely source, or some of you will be like, oh, well, no surprise. So I have an article here from topsecretwriters.com, and the article looks like it was written by a woman named Sally Painter. And how it all started is a subsection of this article that she talks about how the term conspiracy theory all started. So I'm going to read it and hopefully not get banned for reading her stuff on here. We'll see how that pans out for us. I don't know. Um, so, how it all started. It seems that the conspiracy theory brainchild was first revealed in a 1976 dispatch. The communication was marked Psych and CS. The Psych abbreviation referred to psychological operations, or what is better known in the modern world as disinformation. The CS was the abbreviation for their clandestine services unit. Why was why was a dispatch sent out? According to Zero Hedge, it was generated in a response to a Freedom of Information Act request by the New York Times in 1976. The dispatch first discussed how concerning this trend of request was to organizations as well as the U.S. government. The missive went out, or the missive went on to explain the purpose of the dispatch, which was to provide material countering and discrediting the claims of the conspiracy theorist, so so as to inhibit the circulation of such claims in other countries. This was followed by an explanation that the background information could be found in the classified section as well as unclassified documents attached to the dispatch. If there wasn't any discussion already taking place, then the question of it being a conspiracy wasn't to be brought up. Only where a discussion was underway was the conspiracy question to be inserted and used to create doubt. And then it goes on to say the first directive was to discuss how this was a publicity problem with friendly elite contacts, especially politicians and editors. So the term conspiracy theory was basically created by, allegedly, what seems to be basically created by the CIA. And, well, why would the CIA want to discredit people with their
Mm.
conspiracy theories? I think if I was the CIA, I'd be trying to hire those people.
Sounds like somebody trying to control the rhetoric. They
Yeah,
want to control the narrative.
they want to control the rhetoric or the narrative, and which is another thing that I didn't think about until just now when you said that was there was actually it was either a New York Times or a Washington Post article that basically says that using critical thinking skills during this time isn't appropriate and that you should just listen to what the hierarchy of the United States government says or
Are
what.
you saying it was reported that you should not use critical thinking?
Yes, it was reported that you should not use critical thinking during this time, and I'm like, we're in the middle of a pandemic, guys. We should definitely be using critical thinking and like having, brainstorms and think tanks and all kinds of crazy ways to come up with a solution to our problem.
Well, the idea of not using critical thinking has been accused by with some folks of eroding away at the American education system that has deteriorated the critical thinking skills of the uh, curriculum. The curriculum basically takes people away from that. Part of that is not reporting all of history. To the victor goes the spoils in conflict, but they also are controlling how the history is written.
Well, that's for sure. As a young man that grew up in the United States, I can relate to what you just said because I was taught all my life that the United States was responsible for freeing the Jewish people. Well, it turns out we were somewhat responsible. That's the mainstream's media's favorite word to use is somewhat, so that's what I'm going to use now on this podcast. It was some they were we were somewhat responsible, but ultimately at the end of the day, Stalin's who marched into Berlin and knocked down the wall. Well, he didn't knock down the wall, but later on in life, the wall got knocked down by Reagan. But he knocked down a lot of walls when he went into Berlin,
Right.
and then
Yeah.
Stalin became evil. A lot of people say Stalin was a terrible man, but he's responsible for helping free the Jewish people during the Holocaust.
Right. That was an ally
Yeah.
in our when we were battling that. World War situation. So, sadly, that has gotten twisted. And even when communism fell, and what is left after the USSR, and we just talk about that, and of course, communism still exists. We still see it in China. But, as you alluded, Reagan had uh, some things going on that changed things in Germany, broke down the wall. There was then the Iron Curtain was starting to crumble, and we had a breakdown of communism in the USSR. Well, as the USSR broke, there was no longer communism in the USSR. It was elsewhere, and there are concerns that we're still trying to vilify and keep the Cold War alive.
Yeah, definitely. I can agree with that. That we're trying to vilify and keep the Cold War alive because these little proxy wars, as I had said earlier in a phone conversation, or this thing that's going on in Ukraine. It's not even a war; it's a conflict. My opinion is we don't really have any business being there. We should just stay out of their business. And the other thing that I think is interesting too is that all three countries involved, which obviously all three main countries involved, meaning the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, all have presidents, and they all have presidents. And this is one of the only conflicts I can remember in history and learning about history myself, where three presidents were kind of in a conflict with each other. And for quite some time there, for the past couple weeks, it seemed like the Ukrainian president was in a conflict with the Russian president and also the United States president. And he's calling for the tensions to be diffused. And he seems like the unlikely guy that just happened to get stuck in the middle of Russia and the U.S.'s Cold War. So I've heard people running around saying this is the start of maybe World War III. I think this is the start of Cold War II.
Well, that would, or the latest installment, the latest battle,
Yeah,
for
the
sure.
latest battle, and the only time in my life that I can remember that we there wasn't some issue with Russia in the United States was over the course of the past few years. There wasn't much said about Russia. We didn't really hear anything. After 2016, we didn't hear anything. 2021 rolls around, and all of a sudden it's Russia, 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 and Ukraine. And it's kind of hard to know what's going on there because, well, we don't hear much from the people that live in Ukraine. And it does make me wonder, why don't we hear very much from the people of Ukraine? We only hear what the media tells us and what their officials say.
Sure.
So, is Ukraine locked down? I don't know. We have one side saying, well, we're just trying to secure our borders, and as we know now, they have moved into eastern Russia or eastern Ukraine, and we're sending troops over there. And this is just an odd time to be alive, I think, as someone living in the United States, to look at this and say, well, what exactly are we doing? It's kind of like Vietnam mashed up with the Cold War,
Mm-hmm.
except for there is a civil war going on in Ukraine because there's separatist forces in Ukraine that are controlling an area. So there's a civil war in Ukraine, and you have these two larger entities pushing towards it. Now NATO's involved, sanctions have happened, the economy's in kind of a disaster. I don't care what anybody tells you, the economy is a disaster, because it is. It can look as good as everyone wants, and you can think that it going up as fast as it did is a good thing, and that's just not one person's fault. That's a lot of people's fault, mainly politicians' fault for doing some really goofy things like sanctioning one of the world's largest energy suppliers without a backup plan. And it wasn't just this administration that did that. We had sanctions before this. We've had sanctions against them since the beginning of the first Cold War. So, like you said, it's the continuance of the Cold War. But I think
It
that
is.
even with someone that I think has pretty decent critical thinking skills, meaning myself, I think this is a tough situation to look at and try to decipher what's going on with all this news. and
Yeah,
propaganda and disinformation. And on top of that, the obvious nobody wants to talk about, and I don't want to talk about it either, is, well, we're living in a worldwide pandemic. Who can decipher any of this information right now?
especially when there's so many um, stories that are being shared that are totally representing opposite sides of an experience, you know, and then you pull other people in. Well, as you said, we haven't heard much about Ukraine. We have none of us in the U.S. have heard widely what has been going on in Ukraine before this. You know, we didn't. I noticed myself when I saw that map. Ukraine looked a whole lot bigger than it did once before, and
Yeah, I can agree
that's
with
come
that.
out as to why it looks so much bigger, because Russia was part of securing more land and having it come under the rule of the Ukraine and Belarusians or Belarusian. So,
Belarus.
but yeah, Belarus. That's it. Thank you. There's been a lot of stuff we have not heard of.
Well, that's like Crimea. Not very many people knew about what happened in Crimea, that Russia took Crimea, until after it happened. And then it was like, wait a minute, what is that? What's going on over there? That's kind of like
Right.
the war in Yemen. Our own media hid the war in Yemen, which is technically a conflict, but it's their own civil war or something along those lines going on there. And that's another situation that we don't really have much information about because it was hidden from us for a really long time. And
Mm-hmm.
thank God for an undercover journalist like Julian Assange that may or may not have done some criminal activities that he's being held for, and I don't have the latest update on what's going on with Assange other than he had filed for his appeal, and they were going to hear his appeal. But Julian Assange was an undercover reporter, and I think we need more of those right now. But at the same time, do we really need more people reporting more information? Or do we
There's a
just
question.
need real people reporting information instead of somebody that gets paid three figures a year to go on the TV and say whatever they tell them to say? Like,
Mm-hmm.
would you go on TV and say whatever they tell you to say for $100,000 a year?
I mean, it certainly looks appealing to somebody who needs the work. You know.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a meltdown in some of the mainstream media. Obviously, the ratings have all dropped, and then we're seeing, the ratings are dropping because I think people with critical thinking skills that are using more than 10% of their brain have acknowledged that, wow, this is kind of getting to be like some serious weird gray area that we're
Well,
not involved in.
it's not the world of your grandparents where there were three networks and a test pattern after a certain time at night, and people are getting their news from more than just one place now with the opening of the internet.
Yeah,
And
and I
yeah, it has its problems because there are many things that are just thrown out there. um, I noticed myself, I question journalism when people can't spell.
oh, definitely, and I've
uh,
seen
and
spelling.
and that is a considerable earmark, you know.
Well, I've seen spelling errors from everything from Fox News to MSNBC to CNN, and just all of them. I've seen all the mainstream media, and I've watched all their ratings drop. The bigger podcasts get, and the bigger shows like Joe Rogan's show gets, Joe Rogan Experience. The more and more the mainstream media drops because my generation is now consuming that kind of content and content like this rather than turning on CNN because they don't want to listen to it anymore. After you hear CNN producers that get arrested or resigned because of illicit activities, and that's a topic that's probably not appropriate for all of the listeners, but I imagine some of the people that are listening to this know about the allegations that have come out from CNN. And I'm not saying whether or not those allegations are true because they're allegations. And in this nation, we believe that, you're innocent until proven guilty. So we'll find out as time goes on here what's going to happen. But if you're following all of this and you're reading more than one news source, that's where the critical thinking kind of starts to come into play, that you shouldn't just be consuming one person's content or
Right.
one media's content
And
because you
somewhere along the way, you have to wonder where's ground zero? Where did this idea first come from that everybody's dogpiling onto? You know,
yeah, I imagine.
sometimes that's got propaganda at the root of it, and maybe somebody's spreading disinformation from so far back nobody realizes it.
Yeah, it's hard to form any kind of opinion right now because there's so much what seems like yelling and screaming about everything. It
I
seems
don't know.
like
I
there's,
think it's pretty easy to form opinions. People are doing it all the time.
well, yeah, some people can form opinions, but I don't know if
But how
that's,
about an informed opinion?
yeah, I think it makes it hard to form an informed opinion, like you just said,
Yeah,
because there's,
that's and people don't concern themselves whether they're informed or not. They want to just believe that hey, they heard it, they have their ideas. That's it.
yeah. I mean, I can get on my phone right now and pull up some fake news article, and then at the bottom of the screen in real small print it says satire. People are running around screaming about guys like Alex Jones and stuff that he's nuts, blah blah blah. But if you read what he says and you read his website, it'll tell you right on there. It's satire. It's
Mm-hmm.
satire. There might be some factual information in what he's saying. That doesn't mean everything he says is true because it's satire.
Right,
And people are running around screaming that he's a crazy nut job, and I'm like, whoa, slow down. You didn't even read that it was satire yet, you know?
right. There's a lot of literary tools that people are using to communicate, and when you lose sight that there's something behind the crafting of the words, you have a totally different understanding.
Yeah, for sure. That's kind of what I wanted to come on this show and start this show that we're on right now so I could talk about these things so people slow down and hopefully start to read all of the fine print and everything and realize that sometimes they're jumping the gun and they're forming their opinion based on stuff that's taken out of context. There's no context to anything, that a lot of the, like, a Facebook meme has no context really. Unless you're
Right,
aware of what the Facebook meme is about, then you have no idea. And even if you are aware of what it's about, that still might not be accurate. We see these fact checkers fact checking everything, and some of them have gone too far. I'd mentioned earlier in the week to you that there was a fact check about gas going from $1.86 to $3.75 a gallon or $3.79 a gallon or whatever it said. And somebody fact checked it and said, well, the national average never reached that. I'm like, it's a meme. It's literally a meme. Calm
right.
down. It's a meme. It doesn't say anything about the national average in there. You're losing your minds over trying to project your idea or your fact checking baseless opinion, which has come out in recent times in the media that fact checkers is, well, it's the opinion of mainstream whether or not it's real. Well, are we going to let a couple thousand people from mainstream media control everyone? I don't think so. You know?
Well, you'd like to not think so.
Yeah, I'd like to not think so, even though I saw it happen. You know?
Hard to go ahead and deny what your eyes see.
Yeah, it's hard to deny what your eyes see, it hasn't controlled everyone. You know, it's just controlled a few. And when I say a few, that's because, well, there's 330 some million Americans, roughly. How many Americans are walking around watching CNN now? Not very many when their ratings dropped by 90% from one period to this next time period. I don't think that the people watching CNN represent America. I think that 200 million viewers plus that Joe Rogan has represents the world a lot. Well, that doesn't even represent the world because there's 7.8 billion and some odd people in the world. So, you know, everybody's entitled to an opinion. That doesn't make it an informed opinion.
And sharing opinions or sharing ideas, that's part of discourse in a civilization. And the more we can be civil about it, the more we might be able to tear things apart and figure something out as to, you know, where's somebody's regional truth that gas is taking a hike, and begin to understand what is a general truth, you know?
Yeah, are gas prices on the rise? Yeah. Do I know exactly the national average and everything? The average person isn't walking around that in their with their brain. They're only using 10% of roughly. Uh, they're not walking around knowing exactly what the national average is, and I don't think some guy like me sitting behind a computer that made that meme thought to look up and make sure, well, let's make sure that this is the national gas average before we make this meme. And the fact check came from the media. Why does the media get to fact check everyone? I thought the media was supposed to report the news, not make it.
Right. Yeah.
So if I see a fact check from USA Today, it seems like it's just that's where critical thinking comes back into all of this. It makes no sense that the news is deciding what's fact and what's fiction. We used to decide that was an encyclopedia.
Now we have Wikipedia.
And now we have Wikipedia that's been hacked multiple times. And then we got WikiLeaks. So you have Wikipedia, you have WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks had 17,000 documents that were supposedly stolen, and then, well, they had to own up to some of the mistakes, like the war in Yemen, because of what was leaked. I would just hope that this show can bring the civil back into discourse so people can communicate and also give people like a safe place to talk about different things because along with critical thinking you have conspiracy theories which involves critical thinking or else you wouldn't be able to piece that all together to come up with the theory. And then a place for people to talk about paranormal experiences. That's one thing that you don't hear about in the news. You don't hear about paranormal experiences. You don't hear about, and sometimes paranormal experiences aren't bad ones. They're not all scary.
Right.
And then you don't hear about the spiritual growth journey that people are going through. And you're a reverend. Maybe you can touch base on what a spiritual journey is about.
Awakening.
And I think we've seen the world awakening. We've seen the masses rise up in different countries and protest some of the stuff that's happened over the course of the past 2 years.
Yes.
And our own media didn't televise it, but we saw it because, well, our generation came up with some cool ideas. They came up with Twitter, Twitch, Discord, all these different things. Facebook, obviously, and some of these platforms are censoring some of these things. So, what did we do? Well, we created a place that can't be
Oh,
censored.
and the difficult thing about awakening, people are awakening in different places in their lives to different ideas. So some of the things that one person's going to wake up to is not going to resonate with someone else because it's not their path. It's not what they're awakening to. You know, maybe this person's awakening to, oh boy, it's a good idea to go ahead and have your mind, body, and spirit in balance and exercise, read, uh, spend time with your family and not be so devoted to work that it you become enslaved to it. And maybe somebody else is going to go ahead and have mystical experiences that are going to be only understood by themselves because they are just for themselves. It's all about everybody's journey being separate. So awakening is many different things to many different people.
Yeah, and I think you kind of get that kind of could be related to some of the stories that are in the Bible. You know, the books of all of the different men in the Bible that wrote down their experience and what they saw. Well, they all didn't see the same exact thing. It never says that anywhere. And yeah, in modern day, I think that if you said something along the lines of what some of those men wrote down in the most holy book, so that, well, they might lock you up and put you in a straitjacket. You know, there's times where I've thought, wow, what did I see out of the corner of my eye? And thought, well, you just don't tell anyone stuff like that sometimes. You keep it to yourself, or you find a community of people that is awakened to that, and you talk to them about it.
Right. And really, that's the only way you're going to follow your awakening. The awakening is coming from deep within. It's a psychological journey as well as spiritual because you're renewing your mind. You're having changes occur with how you see things. Um, why did you see something out of the corner of your eye? What was happening that precipitated it? What happened? What was going on in your mind? What issues were you having in life? A lot of people. So I'm also a paranormal investigator, and when I go ahead into a situation, I'm generally the only minister there, and I'm dealing with it from a people perspective. And I see a lot where many investigators are just looking at phenomenon. I go in, I ask, tell me about what's been going on with your family. Like, what was the biggest major stress you've had prior to this happening? Because those things are very telling. Oh, you've been moving around. This is the third house you've lived in, and it's the third home you've been drawn to where there was a haunting going on. That's interesting, you know?
Yeah,
So this entire family is being challenged to awaken to something. And it's not the same entity following them. This is crazy. We don't want to live with this. We got to move. And then they find another place and it's haunted too. And there's more to life than in everyone else's philosophy, as Shakespeare said. You know,
yeah. In the Bible it talks about the seen and the unseen, and it kind of goes along with what you're saying. And I think that not everything in the dark's always bad. There's some good stuff there that
right?
is just hidden from the average everyday Joe walking around, or the average everyday Jill walking around. You know, like,
Well, I think too we see in the modern world our eyes, where we get light, where we see light, are bombarded with images constantly, whether it is newspaper, computer, phone, interactions. There's so much stimulation, it's hard for the inner workings of the mind to step back and say, what is going on in my life? So that works on the unconscious and it starts to bubble up and you try to make sense of it. And that's what's going on when you have an awakening.
oh yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. I'm not gonna get into my whole personal experience myself, but I'm definitely a believer that there's something bigger than human beings. And I'll just leave it at that because I'm a pretty open-minded person, and I'd like to hear everyone else's stories before I told them mine, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh, but I definitely think that there's this thing, and I'll just touch base on my experience. I won't go into detail. I lived in a house, and, well, some weird stuff was happening there. I moved into another house, and, well, weirder stuff happened there. And it was after some trauma that happened, so some people could say it was through grief, or some people could say, well, it was just that you were aware of it. And I did call a paranormal investigator at one point and said, hey. And actually, that's how I ended up meeting Rick here, Reverend Rick Cempie. That's how I ended up meeting him, was because I called a paranormal investigating team because my kids were scared. And other than that, I'm not going to get real far into the details of how it all unfolded because I'd rather save that for a whole nother show, maybe just on
Right.
my own. But it's really real when it happens to you. And I think
Yeah.
there's a million people out there that should have a place like this to be able to come on and share their experience.
And, you framed that nicely, and I appreciate the way you did it because it does not happen to everybody. So I understand their difficulty believing. But, you know, the fact that something happens and you're like, I was there. Every normal human is going to go through the rational ideas. What
Um,
else could have made this happen?
yeah,
Well,
a relative of mine, I'm not going to mention their name, had messaged me and said, I saw an orb. And I'm like, oh yeah? I just kind of blew it off nonchalantly. I'm like, oh yeah? And then went on to say, I saw an apparition. And I'm like, oh yeah? Well, 2 years ago, that person would have been like, no, that didn't happen. I'm just, I don't
right.
know. Maybe I'm just, hallucinating is what they might have said. And surprisingly enough, you're going to find out through some of your experiences, if you haven't yet, and you're going through some trauma, that your counselor may or may not agree and say, well, as long as you're not being told to do anything crazy, it's probably okay and it's probably safe. That I see tons of people that have guardian angels, spirit guides, spirits. I don't know. Some people might come in there and just call them straight up ghost. I don't think ghost is the right word. I think maybe that we should have a civil rights movement for ghost or spirits. We should have a civil rights movement for spirits so we don't call them ghosts. I think it's a terrible term because, like, we all saw Casper, you know?
I jokingly refer to some of this as the bodily challenged.
Yeah, yeah, the bodily challenge and the
Yeah,
people that are
they have
alive.
no body.
Yeah, and I've heard the being alive and in a human body is called the human experience because of the idea of consciousness.
Yeah,
So maybe we're the ones that are kind of detained in our human body. Maybe being the spirit's not so bad.
it's all part of life.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely, it's all part of life for sure. And, well, hopefully that,
I
uh,
think this is going to be a lot of great stuff to continue talking about through the course of your podcast.
well, I appreciate that. I think that hopefully, forgive us for the rough first show. Hopefully you guys will stick with us and stick around to find out more because there's more to come. Like, we're going to talk about all kinds of crazy stuff. And when I say crazy, I don't know if it's really crazy or not. We're going to talk about some paranormal experiences with a Wendigo, maybe some aliens, maybe that's not the right term for them either. Maybe they're called extraterrestrials. Maybe they're dimensional. Nobody really knows. Or UAPs, which stands for Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, which, well, I'm not sure exactly what that means yet either because the Navy doesn't, but they're aware
That's the
of it.
new term for UFOs for people who haven't heard. But
Yeah, according to the Navy, not according to this podcast. It's according to the Navy. That's the new technical term for unidentified flying objects is now unidentified aerial phenomenon, which is another conspiracy theory thing that we could get into, or it's not a conspiracy because the Navy's saying so. But who really knows because the media told us,
right,
you know?
it's a whole lot easier when you have more facts.
Yeah.
And critical thinking definitely suggests we wait and just have civil discourse to enjoy sharing information to see what's going to unfold.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that. You kind of have to wait. And the famous saying is the difference between a conspiracy theory and a conspiracy is like 6 months or something. And then usually the facts that come out to back it up. We have a
Right.
ton of new ones coming out, hopefully soon. And I don't know if it'll just be me or if I'll have a guest on. I might actually bring my wife on, and we might discuss some of these things. She hasn't got to watch an episode that I had mentioned earlier to you yet, but she's kind of into some of this stuff, and maybe not so much conspiracy theories, more spiritual growth stuff, tarot cards, psychics, mediums, all of it, metaphysical stuff, crystals, rocks, whatever. Um,
Oils,
yeah,
herbs.
there's there's all different kinds of stuff coming out, and we're hoping to just be able to bring that to light. We have another guy that's hopefully coming on, which is a friend of me and Rick's, to talk about his paranormal experience and how to guard yourself from the bad entities or the bad energy, because nobody really knows if it's energy or it's entities. He might, and I'm not going to say his name right now until he's ready to come on the show because I'm not sure what he wants to be called when he comes on the show. So, yeah, I think that we're at a place where we're going to have some really, really good content coming out soon. We have this conspiracy, a brand new conspiracy theory that just came out the other day on 60 Minutes that we can talk about on another show. And we also have the most recent event, which was yesterday, which was the Pluto return.
Yeah,
And hopefully we're
I've
going to
been
have,
talking about that for quite a while. It's
yeah.
been a big looming issue, and for those who don't understand anything about astrology, every year on your birthday, the sun makes its return to where it was the day you were born. That's called a solar return. Well, Pluto, being so far, takes a lot longer to work its way around to the original position when you were born, about 250 years, give or take. So the nation of the United States has been experiencing the beginning of its Pluto return for quite a while. It moves very slowly, so it gets ramped up. And now we're at this culmination point. So things are going to start taking different turns. And for the next several years, we're going to see even more stuff coming. What we're going to see exactly, we don't know. We do know the areas of life are just going to be turned up on their end.
And then reborn.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. Because it takes care of getting exposure to the dark underbelly and creates a better situation in the end. So it's nothing to really be feared. It's all about growth. And that's a great segue. If you don't mind, I'd be happy to share for people who would be interested if they're curious about some experiences. I do astrology and tarot readings. You can find me on Facebook at kempiescorner.com. Excuse me, Kempie's Corner on Facebook. And that's CEMPIE apostrophe S. Kempie's Corner.
Yeah, and we can always post a link to your Facebook too whenever we share the
Sounds good.
podcast. Just want to tell everybody we're using Podbean. We're hopefully going to be on Spotify, iTunes. Hopefully by the time this gets on there, it'll just be on there, and you guys will be like, well, why did he say that? So there's a little humor involved here. I just want everyone to know that too.
Learning curve, too.
What was that?
As far as a learning curve, too, as to how things are going to show up when this finally comes to fruition.
Yeah,
Gets
yeah, this
launched.
is definitely a new experience, but I think it's going to be a good one, and we're going to have hopefully a lot of guests on. And I don't know who all these guests are going to be yet because, well, I'm still waiting for people to email me. So email me, email the show. It's thebullshitter@gmail.com, and it's spelled DASHETTER @gmail.com. If you want to be a guest and you want to talk about your experience, I don't care what your experience is about. It can be spiritual growth, paranormal, a conspiracy theory. Maybe you want to talk about some new age technology. I wanted to include that too because, well, we need to save the world because, well, the climate's obviously not doing so hot right now. Well, it is doing real hot, and that's the problem. We need to cool it down. Um, I don't know exactly why. I can't agree with everyone else's theories on that, but there's some people that might want to come on the show and explain a little more. I'm not an expert in that. And
And
hopefully,
just to clarify, the bullshitter at gmail.com. That's
yes,
DABULLSHETTER at gmail.com. Right?
yes, yes.
Okay.
That's the email for the show. And like I was saying, there's a ton of different things I want to just to go over, and whether it's astrology, spiritual growth, paranormal experiences, conspiracy theories, new age technology, and just business owners dealing with some serious BS. That's like our new catch slogan is some serious BS. And if you're watching the show, you've probably seen that in the introduction to the show by now on Podbean or Facebook or Twitter or Getar or TikTok. And honestly, off the top of my head, I can't know them all right now. I don't remember them all off the top of my head right now. So hopefully everyone can stick with us, and hopefully, we're going to come out with some more content. Rick's not always going to be on the show all the time. Every once in a while, he might be on the show. Every once in a while, we might get to see my wife. And sometimes we might get to see other people. And hopefully, it's a lot of other people. Because we want to open up the door for communication between people. So if you're from the city, we want to hear from you. And if you're from, I don't know, the mountains of Colorado, I want to hear from you.
I know I've gone ahead and thought about some people I might tap to send your way.
Well, I'd appreciate that if you do. Like I said, hopefully everyone can stick with us. Sorry for a bumpy start, but as everyone knows, like Joe Rogan show didn't start out like formally. It just started out while he was sitting around, Well, everybody knows, but we're not going to say it on the podcast because we don't want to get banned. But we know what he was doing, and then came up with the idea to do this. And I'm not stealing an idea or anything like that. It's just I think that we need real people. He's a celebrity. We need real people to start talking, and instead of text, because text have no context.
Well, thank you for including me on your maiden podcast. Getting a launch. It's really an interesting experience to see where it'll go. I
Yeah,
look forward to finding all the comments.
yeah. And hey, if it doesn't go anywhere, maybe we can both look back and laugh and say, "Remember that time I tried to start a podcast and it didn't work out? Because I tried to start a podcast in the middle of a Pluto return? Maybe that wasn't the brightest idea, but at the same time, maybe it was."
Right.
We'll just have to wait and see, just like we have to wait and see if a conspiracy theory turns out to be just a conspiracy. So,
Well, you take care. It was great talking with you.
you too, bud.
And I am looking forward to see what happens on the bullshitter.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, and hopefully we can get some more support from some of your followers.
Sure thing.
All right. We'll see you later.
Over and out.
All right. Bye.